Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're taking a deep dive today into something that I think you'll find really fascinating, and that's realism.
Ooh, realism. Yes. One of those big ideas that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, really. It gets to the core of, how we understand knowledge and what exists.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that maybe to someone who doesn't think about philosophy all the time might think, well, that's kind of obvious. Like the world is just out there, like there's a table and there's a chair and it's all real, whether we're thinking about it or not. But philosophy kind of takes that intuition and digs a lot deeper.
Oh, it goes so much deeper. Yeah, the everyday understanding is a great starting point. But, philosophical realism, it's not just about things existing, but they exist and have properties independent of our minds, our perceptions, our beliefs, everything. Like, think about it this way. Would the moon still be round if no one was around to observe it or even think about it?
That's a good question.
The realist says absolutely yes.
Okay, so realism is really about this kind of out there quality of existence and truth. But I get the feeling, and from reading some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, that it's about to get a whole lot more complex because we're not, diving straight into realism. We're actually looking at arguments against realism,
Hmm.
which is an interesting way to go about it. It's sort of like, your enemy.
Exactly. Yeah, by looking at those challenges to realism, we can understand so much more about, the concept itself, the strengths, the weaknesses, all the implications that come out of it. It's sort of like we're trying to understand how a building is built by looking at the cracks and stresses that threaten to topple the whole thing over.
All right, I'm ready to get into some of those cracks. We've got some
Yeah.
really great material today from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Realism, and just looking at it already makes my brain hurt a little bit. We've got arguments about numbers and morality, all sorts of just really interesting, heady stuff.
Well, let's just jump right in with something that's a little bit radical, and that's the error theory of arithmetic,
The error theory of arithmetic.
which challenges the very existence of numbers as abstract objects.
Wait, are they saying that numbers don't exist? Because, I use them all the time. I count, I measure, I do all sorts of practical things in the world.
Yeah.
It seems a bit extreme to just say numbers don't exist.
It does sound a little counterintuitive, doesn't it? But the argument isn't actually about the practical usefulness of numbers, but it's more about their ontological status, so what kind of things they are, if they even exist at all.
Okay, so then what's the problem with numbers from a philosophical perspective? Are they just too abstract or too conceptual to be considered real in the same way as like a tree or a rock?
That's really the heart of the issue. Think about it this way. If numbers are these abstract, non-physical entities, then how do they interact with the physical world? How can we have knowledge of something that is causally inert, meaning it doesn't actually cause anything to happen in the world that we experience?
And that's where that term causally inert comes in, right? It means they can't bump into me, they can't make me think a thought, they can't have an impact on the physical world. So how can we claim to know them if they're so detached from our experience?
And that is exactly the challenge that's posed by philosophers like Ben Esaraf.
Uh,
How can we know something that doesn't interact with us or the world in a causal way if numbers have no causal role? How can our beliefs about them be anything more than just lucky guesses?
So it's like saying that unless a number can poke me in the eye,
Yeah.
I can't really say that I know it.
You got it.
But then how do we explain the incredible success of math?
Okay.
If numbers don't exist, then how can math be so unbelievably powerful in describing and predicting the world?
And this is where things get even more interesting. So a philosopher named Hartree Field has this fascinating response. He argues that, the usefulness of math doesn't require the existence of these abstract numbers. Instead, he proposes that math is conservative.
Yeah.
So its usefulness lies in its ability to help us derive conclusions that we could have gotten from other, more concrete premises.
So it's almost like math is more like a tool, a shortcut to get to where we want to go rather than a window into some realm of Platonic numbers that are out there.
Exactly. Think of it this way. So instead of saying 7 is a prime number, we could in principle rephrase that statement in terms of more concrete relationships between physical objects. It would be much more complex, much more cumbersome, but it would avoid the need to actually posit the existence of that abstract entity, 7.
Yeah, it would be really hard to talk that way.
It would.
But I'm starting to see how this error theory of arithmetic challenges the realist view. It's not that numbers are these independent abstract entities out there, but they become more like useful fictions, these tools that help us navigate the world, but don't necessarily correspond to some deep objective reality that's out there. It's a pretty radical shift.
It is. And this challenge to the existence of numbers raises all these other important questions about how we form beliefs and what constitutes knowledge if we can't explain, the reliability of our mathematical beliefs in terms of a causal connection
Hmm.
to these abstract numbers. Then what grounds our confidence in those beliefs? What makes them more than just lucky guesses?
Right. It's like the rug's been pulled out from under us.
Yeah.
But this error theory, it's not just about numbers, right? I remember reading something about an error theory of morality. Is that a similar idea?
It is, but with some important distinctions.
Okay.
So J.L. Mackie, a prominent moral philosopher, he argued that while we can accept the existence of people and their actions, it's those properties we ascribe to those actions like good or evil that become problematic from a realist perspective.
So unlike the number debate where the entities themselves are in question here, we're questioning the qualities we attach to things, right?
hmm
So like Napoleon definitely existed, but was he really evil in some objective sense?
That's a great way to put it. Mackey's argument hinges on this idea that moral facts, if they do exist, would have to be objective and categorically prescriptive, and he challenges the existence of such facts. He argues that our moral judgments are ultimately based on our subjective responses, cultural norms, personal preferences, things like that.
Okay, so let's unpack those terms a little bit.
Yeah.
So categorically prescriptive means that a moral rule applies regardless of what I want, right? So like stealing is wrong, even if I really, really want that diamond necklace. It's not about what I want. It's about some objective standard of right and wrong.
Exactly. Mackey argues that such objective prescriptive facts simply don't exist in the world. He gives two main arguments for this, the argument from queerness and the argument from relativity.
Well, let's start with queerness. That sounds intriguing, if not a little bit strange.
It is a provocative term, but it captures a key aspect of his critique. He argues that if these objective moral values did exist, they would be utterly different from anything else in the universe. They would have this inherent to-be-pursuedness built into them, somehow motivating us to act in certain ways.
It's like imagining some kind of moral force field emanating from those actions that make them inherently right or wrong. Like a glowing aura of goodness around, helping an old lady cross the street and then like crackling lightning bolts of badness when someone cuts you off in line.
Right, and Mackey argues that this queerness, this idea of objective moral properties that intrinsically motivate us, is metaphysically suspect. It doesn't fit with our understanding of how the natural world actually works.
Yeah, it does feel kind of strange to think of morality operating like some kind of supernatural force. But what about the argument from relativity? How does that one challenge the idea of objective moral facts?
Well, the argument from relativity points to the wide diversity of moral beliefs across cultures and throughout history. If moral facts were objective and independent of human thought, wouldn't we expect more agreement on some of those basic moral principles?
Yeah, that makes sense. Different cultures have different ideas about, what's right and wrong,
Yeah.
what's considered virtuous or taboo. But couldn't a realist push back and say that, some moral principles are universal, even if their specific applications vary? Like maybe all cultures value fairness, even if they disagree on what constitutes a fair distribution of resources.
And that is a common response, and it leads to a lot of interesting debate. But Mackey was pretty skeptical of those claims of universal moral principles. He argued that the observed diversity of moral beliefs is more easily explained by recognizing the subjective and culturally relative nature of our moral judgments.
So instead of saying murder is objectively wrong, a moral anti-realist might say murder is condemned by the social norms of this particular culture. And so it shifts the focus from some kind of external independent moral realm to like the internal subjective realm of human beliefs and practices.
Exactly, and like the error theory of arithmetic. Mackey's error theory challenges the realist's commitment to the independence of those facts from human judgment.
Wow, it's fascinating how these arguments kind of connect back to this core issue of independence. We've seen how these error theories of arithmetic and morality, question the very existence of numbers and moral facts, suggesting they might be more like useful fictions or cultural constructs than objective features of the world. But I know there are other challenges to realism that take a different approach. Instead of like denying the existence of things outright, they question their independence in more subtle ways.
You're absolutely right, and these challenges are often grouped under the umbrella of anti-realism, and they offer a really nuanced and diverse set of perspectives on the relationship between our minds and the world, and that's where things start to get really, really interesting. So we've explored some arguments that really throw the very existence of things like numbers and moral facts into question, but there's this other really interesting avenue of challenge to realism that I think we need to explore, and that's reductionism.
Reductionism, and just from the name, it sounds like it's all about breaking things down into smaller, simpler parts. But how does that connect to this debate about realism?
Well, reductionism in the context of realism, it tries to explain phenomena in terms of their underlying components or mechanisms. It's about showing that what might appear to be independent and fundamental might actually be dependent on something else.
Okay, I think I'm seeing where this is going. So instead of saying that, like, moral facts exist independently out there, a reductionist might try to explain morality in terms of, say, brain activity or evolutionary pressures.
Mm.
It's like saying that morality isn't this fundamental feature of the universe, but rather a product of more basic physical processes.
You got it. That's one way that reductionism can work, but it's important to make a distinction between two main types of reduction: analytic reduction and non-analytic reduction.
Okay, analytic reduction. That sounds like it's about to get really into the philosophical jargon here.
Hmm.
Can you give me a real-world example to help me wrap my head around what that means?
Absolutely. So let's consider the concept of directions. So a Platonic realist might argue that directions like north, south, east, west, they're abstract objects that exist independently of us. They're part of the furniture of the universe, so to speak.
Right, like they would exist even if there were no compasses, no maps, no humans to even think about them. They're just out there, part of the objective structure of reality.
Precisely. But an analytic reductionist might come along and say, hold on a minute, maybe we can explain talk of directions without having to bring in these abstract entities. They might try to reduce talk of directions to talk about concrete things like lines or physical relationships between objects.
So instead of saying north is that way, I could say something like, if I walk in a straight line from this tree to that rock, I'm walking north. We're grounding that concept of north in a concrete physical relationship between me, the tree, and the rock.
Exactly. The idea is to try to rephrase statements that seem to require these abstract objects into statements about more concrete things. It's like saying we don't need to believe in these abstract directions floating around in some metaphysical realm. We can account for everything we need to say about directions by talking about observable physical relationships.
Okay, that's a clever move. But doesn't it just shift the problem? Even if we can rephrase our language to avoid talking about abstract directions, aren't those concrete relationships still implicitly relying on the concept of direction? Like, how do we know which line between the tree and the rock is north unless we already have some understanding of direction?
That's a great point, and philosophers like William Alston and Crispin Wright have argued that, you know what, analytic reduction might not actually undermine realism in the way that some reductionists hope the realist can push back and say, even if you can translate talk of directions into talk about lines and physical relationships, you haven't eliminated the need for that underlying concept of direction. It's still there lurking beneath the surface.
So it's almost like analytic reduction is more of a linguistic sleight of hand than a genuine challenge to realism.
Yeah.
It changes how we talk about things, but doesn't necessarily change the underlying metaphysical picture. It's like we're playing a language game, but the rules of the game still assume the existence of those abstract entities that we're trying to explain away.
Exactly. It raises the question of whether such reductions genuinely eliminate the need for those seemingly abstract entities or whether they just provide alternative ways of talking about them. But that's not the only form of reductionism. Let's move on to non-analytic reduction, which takes a bit of a different approach.
Okay, lay it on me. What makes non-analytic reduction different?
So non-analytic reduction goes beyond language and tries to explain a phenomenon in terms of its underlying components or mechanisms. Think of the classic example of water being reduced to H2O.
Right, we still talk about water, but we now understand that it's a compound made up of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. It's not that the concept of water has been eliminated, but we have a deeper understanding of what water is at a more fundamental level.
Precisely, and this brings us to a key distinction within non-analytic reduction. It can be either vindicative or eliminativist.
Okay, two new terms, vindicative and eliminativist. Those sound intriguing. What's the difference?
So a vindicative reduction, like the water example, supports our pre-existing beliefs. It gives us a deeper, more scientific explanation for something that we already believe to be real. But an eliminativist reduction aims to show that our initial understanding was flawed and needs to be replaced.
So a vindicative reduction of morality might say, yes, moral judgments are real, and here's how they work in terms of brain processes or social dynamics. But an eliminativist view would be more like, actually, there's no such thing as good or evil. It's all just neurons firing or genes propagating themselves.
You've got a eliminativist reduction is more radical, proposing that our everyday understanding of the phenomenon is fundamentally mistaken. It's like saying we thought there were these independent moral facts, but it turns out they were just illusions created by our brains or our evolutionary history.
Wow, that's a pretty bold move. So reductionism, in both its analytic and non-analytic forms, provides a really powerful set of challenges to realism. It suggests that what we might think of as independent objective features of the world might actually be dependent on more fundamental entities or processes, whether those be physical, biological, or even linguistic.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really fascinating challenge to realism, one that focuses on the relationship between language meaning and truth, semantic realism.
Semantic realism, that sounds almost like a contradiction in terms, isn't realism about the world, not about words and their meanings.
It might seem that way at first, but the connection really lies in how we understand truth and our ability to know things. Semantic realism, as championed by the philosopher Michael Dummett, is closely tied to this idea of recognition transcendent truth.
Okay, here comes the philosophical heavy artillery. What exactly is recognition transcendent truth, and how does it challenge realism?
So, recognition transcending truth is this idea that a statement can be true, even if we have no way of knowing or proving it. Think about a statement like, there are an infinite number of prime numbers. Mathematicians believe this to be true, but proving it definitively might be beyond our current mathematical capabilities.
So it's possible that some truths are, in principle, unknowable. They exist out there, but we might never be able to grasp them or verify them.
Exactly. A semantic realist would say that such statements still have a definite truth value, even if we can't determine what that truth value is. The truth in this sense transcends our ability to recognize or prove it.
I see. But how does this challenge the independence aspect of realism? It seems like it's just saying that some truths might be difficult or even impossible for us to access, but not that those truths are somehow dependent on our minds.
That's where Dummett's ingenious argument comes in. He argues that if we accept this idea of recognition transcendent truth, we run into problems when we're trying to explain how we can understand language and have knowledge. And he presents this powerful argument known as the manifestation argument to support this claim.
All right, Professor, time for another philosophy lesson. Break down this manifestation argument for me. How does it work?
So the manifestation argument starts from the premise that understanding a sentence involves knowing its truth conditions. So, for example, to understand the sentence, the cat is on the mat, you need to know what would have to be the case for that sentence to be true. There would have to be a cat, there would have to be a mat, and the cat would have to be situated on the mat.
Right. That seems pretty straightforward to understand a sentence.
Yeah.
You need to know what would make it true.
Now, Dummett's key move is to link understanding to this ability to manifest that understanding through our actions and our behavior. He argues that if our understanding of a sentence consists in knowing its truth conditions, and those truth conditions are recognition transcendent, meaning we might never be able to know them for sure, then our ability to manifest our understanding should also be able to transcend our ability to recognize those truth conditions.
Wait, so you're saying that if I understand a sentence that has a potentially unknowable truth value, my actions should somehow reflect that unknowability. How could my behavior demonstrate something that I can't even grasp?
That's precisely the problem that Dummett is highlighting. He argues that our practical abilities, the ways we manifest our understanding, are always grounded in what we can recognize and respond to in the world. We can't act based on knowledge that we don't have.
So if I can't act based on potentially unknowable truths, and my understanding is linked to my actions, then I can't truly understand sentences with those kinds of truth conditions.
Exactly. The manifestation argument essentially claims that semantic realism, with its commitment to this recognition transcendent truth, leads to an incoherent view of understanding and knowledge. It suggests that for us to really understand something, it must be connected to our abilities to recognize and respond to it in the world.
Okay, my brain is doing somersaults trying to wrap itself around this. But even if we set aside the technicalities of the manifestation argument, it seems like Dummett is raising some really fundamental questions about the relationship between our mind's language and the world. If we accept that some truths might be forever beyond our grasp, what does that mean for our understanding of reality and our place in it?
Those are profound questions indeed, and they highlight the philosophical depth and complexity of this debate between realism and anti-realism. While we might not have definitive answers, grappling with these challenges can lead us to a more nuanced and insightful understanding of the nature of knowledge, truth, and the world around us.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener so far. We've explored so many different arguments against realism, from the error theory and reductionism to expressivism and now semantic realism. Each one has challenged our assumptions about the independence of the world from our minds and the ways that we can access truth. And from what I remember, we're not done yet.
You're right, there are even more nuanced challenges to realism that focus on that independence aspect rather than denying the existence of things outright. For instance, we could explore Crispin Wright's idea of realism-relevant cruces, which offers a really interesting framework for distinguishing between realist and anti-realist positions about a particular subject matter.
Okay, realism, relevant cruces. Now we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of the realism debate. I'm ready to explore these cruces and see what other philosophical treasures we can uncover.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're back and we're ready to continue our exploration of the philosophical labyrinth of anti-realism, I guess you could call it. And before the break, we were about to dive into Crispin Wright's realism relevant cruces. And it sounds like these are going to be key to understanding how we can even tell the difference between a realist and an anti-realist position about something.
Yeah, they are really key. Wright's idea is that instead of getting bogged down in these sort of abstract definitions, we should look for these very specific points of contention, these cruces, that can help us differentiate between realist and anti-realist views about a certain subject matter. It's a much more pragmatic and I think focused approach to the whole debate.
Yeah, I like the sound of that. It feels like we're moving from like a philosophical free-for-all to more of a targeted duel. I mean,
Yeah.
we're really getting to the heart of the matter. So what are some of these cruces and how do they help us navigate this philosophical battleground?
Well, one really important crux is this idea of width of cosmological role, and this focuses on whether the facts or properties in a certain domain have a role in explaining things beyond our beliefs about them.
Width of cosmological role, that sounds pretty grand. Can you give me a concrete example to help me wrap my head around what that means?
Sure, let's imagine a bridge. So, a realist about bridge structural integrity would say that the fact that a bridge is structurally unsound can explain not only why engineers believe it's unsafe, but also why it might actually collapse under stress. The bridge's structural properties have these real world effects regardless of what anyone thinks.
Right. The bridge's potential to collapse isn't just like some mental construct or just a matter of opinion. It's grounded in the physical reality of the bridge's structure. It has a
Yeah.
wide cosmological role. It influences things that happen in the world beyond just our thoughts about it.
Exactly. And this is where the contrast with the anti realist position becomes really clear. An anti realist about bridge structural integrity might argue that, what the facts about the bridge's soundness only have a narrow cosmological role limited to explaining maybe our beliefs and our practices.
So they might say something like, we believe the bridge is unsafe because our engineering models and calculations tell us so, but the bridge itself doesn't inherently have some property of unsoundness that's like independent of our judgments and calculations.
Precisely, the anti-realist might emphasize, the role of our conceptual frameworks, our methods of assessment, our linguistic practices in shaping how we understand the bridge's stability. They might question whether there's this mind-independent fact of the matter about the bridge's unsoundness, suggesting that it's more of a product of our judgments and interpretations.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this width of cosmological role crux can help us distinguish between these realist and anti-realist positions. It's about whether the facts in a given domain have this sort of causal power, this explanatory reach that goes beyond just our minds and our ways of talking about the world.
Exactly. It's a very subtle but really powerful distinction, and another really crucial crux, and this one I think will particularly resonate with your philosophical background, is this idea of judgment dependence.
Judgment dependence. That sounds like it's getting to the heart of how our minds might actually shape our understanding of reality. Tell me more.
So, this crux focuses on whether the truth about a certain domain is determined, at least in part, by our best judgments under ideal conditions. It asks whether our judgments, when properly formed and informed, can actually make something true.
Okay, that's a little bit mind-bending. So instead of truth being out there independent of us, it becomes, in a sense, created by our judgments.
That's the idea. Let's take an example from aesthetics. So, the concept of beauty is something beautiful because it possesses some intrinsic property of beauty, independent of any observer. Or is it beautiful because we judge it to be so?
That's a question that's puzzled philosophers for centuries. And I can see how this gets right to the heart of the realism debate.
Absolutely. So, a realist about beauty might argue that there are objective standards of beauty that exist independently of our subjective preferences. They might appeal to certain formal properties, proportions, or harmonies that make something intrinsically beautiful.
Like those classical ideals of proportion and symmetry that were believed to be the hallmarks of beauty in art and architecture.
Exactly. But an anti realist about beauty, emphasizing this judgment dependence, might say that beauty is fundamentally in the eye of the beholder. It's our judgments, informed by our cultural background, our personal experiences, our aesthetic sensibilities, that make something beautiful.
So a painting isn't beautiful in some absolute objective sense, but rather it's beautiful because we, the viewers, collectively judge it to be. So our appreciation, in a way, creates the beauty.
That's a great way to put it, and this applies not just to aesthetics, but to other domains as well, like morality, humor, even scientific theories. The question is, do our best judgments under ideal conditions actually play a role in determining what's true in these areas?
It's almost like we're shifting from a picture of reality as this fixed independent realm to a more fluid dynamic view where our minds play an active role in shaping what we consider to be true. It's a humbling but also kind of empowering thought.
It is, and this brings us to, I think, a final perspective on the realism debate, one that kind of steps back from the whole fray and questions the very meaningfulness of the entire discussion, and that's quietism.
Quietism sounds like a philosophical surrender. Are they saying we should just give up on trying to figure out whether realism is true or not?
Not necessarily give up, but perhaps reframe the debate. Quietists argue that these traditional arguments between realists and anti-realists are often based on flawed assumptions, or they lead to these intractable philosophical dead ends.
So they're like the philosophical referees stepping in and saying, all right, everyone break it up. This fight is going nowhere. But why would someone think the whole debate is meaningless or unproductive?
Well, one reason might be the difficulty in articulating precisely what's at stake between realism and anti-realism. As we've seen, there are so many different versions of both positions with subtle distinctions and varying degrees of commitment. It can be hard to pin down exactly what's being affirmed or denied.
Yeah, it does feel like we've been wandering through a philosophical hall of mirrors. Every time we think we've grasped a concept, it shifts and changes and reveals new complexities and interpretations.
Exactly, and some quietists argue that these complexities reveal a deeper problem. There might not be a clear, objective way to settle the debate. It becomes more a matter of personal preference, pragmatic considerations, or linguistic convention, rather than a genuine dispute about the nature of reality.
Yeah, I can see how that would lead to a sense of philosophical fatigue. If there's no objective yardstick to measure the truth of realism or anti-realism, then what's the point of arguing endlessly about it?
That's one way to look at it, but even if we embrace this quietist stance, it doesn't mean that we have to abandon philosophical inquiry altogether. It might simply mean shifting our focus, asking different kinds of questions, and exploring alternative ways of understanding the relationship between our minds and the world.
Yeah, maybe the value of exploring this whole realism debate lies not in finding like a definitive answer, but in the journey itself, the process of critically examining our assumptions, refining our concepts, deepening our appreciation for the complexities and mysteries of existence.
I think that's beautifully put, and on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into realism.
This has been an incredible journey. We've explored so many different facets of the realism debate, encountering challenges to both the existence and independence of the world as the realist sees it. We've examined error theories, reductionism, expressivism, semantic realism, and even the quietist position that kind of tries to reframe the whole discussion.
And throughout this exploration, we've seen how these different perspectives can illuminate this really profound relationship between our minds, our language, and the world that we experience.
Exactly. And for you, our listener, with your philosophical background, we hope that this deep dive has given you some new insights and avenues for reflection. We've tried to present these complex ideas in a way that resonates with your knowledge and your interests, highlighting the nuances and the subtleties of the debate.
We really encourage you to continue pondering these questions, to explore the philosophical literature in more depth, and to engage in these thoughtful dialogues with others about the nature of reality and our place in it.
Because ultimately, philosophy is about this ongoing pursuit of understanding a journey of discovery that has no fixed destination. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into this fascinating world of ideas.